IVM.
I want to thank Intel for supporting our show. Do you remember last year when we spoke about how the Intel vPro platform is built for business? Well, I'm glad to say we've kicked it up a notch. That's right, Intel is back with a new and improved version of the platform. The new Intel vPro platform lets you do more of what you want and less of what you don't. So it's better for you and for your IT teams, who really are the backbone of keeping your work-from-home experience easy and enjoyable. I can safely say that the new vPro platform gives you more enterprise efficiency with less constraints. Visit intel.in/morewithvpro, that's VPRO, to discover how you can get more done with less waiting. If you're listening on the IVM Podcast Android app, click the link that's visible to you now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. We're 6 months into a global pandemic, and there are still conspiracy theories swirling around us about the origins of this novel coronavirus. The least far-fetched theory is that the virus leaked from a lab, and this theory has been more than hinted at by some senior leaders in the United States. Then, of course, there's the idea that this was, in fact, the deliberate use of a purpose-built bioweapon. To be clear, of course, the overwhelming scientific consensus is that it's nothing of that sort. The most bizarre theory that I've heard is that it's spread through 5G networks, and I won't even bother to address that one. But here's the thing. There is a way to clear up the air about the origins of this virus, and it's not just the WHO. To discuss this with me, I have Shambhavi. Welcome, Shambhavi.
Hey, Aditya. Hey, everybody.
Yeah, so I want to we'll get to what that international mechanism with the Biological Weapons Convention is. But first, let's talk about the WHO. What exactly is the WHO supposed to be investigating about this novel coronavirus?
Right. So, as you said, there have been a lot of conspiracy theories about where this virus has come from, how it's spread. And since it's novel, I think there are a lot of questions that are still awaiting addressing. And since the world is occupied with the idea that we need to figure out where this came from, and not necessarily to lay blame, but to basically prevent any further reoccurrence of such a pandemic, it's really important to figure out how it came into humans. And so many countries have petitioned the WHO, and Australia was the leader of this proposal, that they should start an independent investigation into the zoonotic origins of the virus. And the idea is we want to figure out from which animal this virus might have come from, and to then kind of figure out ways to prevent a recurrence. So if I can give you an example, we all remember the 2018 Nipah outbreak, and Nipah is a pretty well characterized virus as compared to the COVID-19 virus. And we know that Nipah is spread by bats. Bangladesh, where it has for many years kept on getting recurrences, eventually traced the new infections to bats who were contaminating date palm sap. And so now they've got guidelines on how to harvest date palm sap and what is a safe date palm sap and what can be consumed. And in that way, they have been able to prevent repeated outbreaks of Nipah. And I think that's the kind of understanding we want to get about SARS-CoV-2, so that we can basically stop it from happening again, or from similar incidences of other viruses happening again. So that's, I think, where the entire investigation is going to be centered. I don't think it is centered around trying to either debunk or prove any conspiracy theories. So its remit is going to be around figuring out the animals from which it came from. Whether it will actually work or not, I think, is a secondary question.
Yeah. Why have the Chinese actually been opposed to this investigation? Why do they want it to actually happen only after the pandemic is washed over?
Yeah, I don't know. And it kind of doesn't make sense. Because by the time, obviously, we have animals which have moved away or moved into territories, you will basically kind of not have enough evidence to form a credible hypothesis on where the virus might have come from. Again, if you go back to the 2018 Nipah case, the index patient was immediately traced. The fact that they had gone into a well full of bats was immediately known. So I think investigations of this sort have to be done extremely quickly. And if you wait for several months to kind of do it, it will be problematic. In fact, if you go back to the seafood market where this is supposed to have all begun. They obviously closed it down pretty early on, and so any evidence there might have been, it will be difficult to decipher from evidence there now. They did find, I think, the SARS-CoV in quite a few animals that were then kept back then. But now to start a fresh inquiry is going to be difficult. Also, I think there was something in the Chinese media recently which suggested that maybe the seafood market was not the place of origin. So it's a little difficult to understand why China might be saying this. Obviously, initially when international community was asking for an investigation, China first said that were very resistant to the idea. Even the UNSC, the United Nations Security Council, in February, I think, when China was the chair, actually did not speak about the pandemic at all, when it was clearly a big global threat that was evolving. So, yeah, China's role is, I think, a little circumspect. They probably don't want an investigation on their grounds. The WHO has been accused of many countries to being biased to China. And now there's also this hidden suspicion on whether China is allowing this inquiry only because it is a WHO based investigation. So there are a lot of questions that remain unanswered.
Right. Yeah, I suspect there is a political angle to this. The Chinese don't actually want this virus to be definitively traced back to their own territory. But let's just move on to the Biological Weapons Convention. Now, of course, this was a convention that came into effect 45 years back in 1975. This actually provides a mechanism for investigating biological weapons attacks. Shambhavi, why has this not been put into effect?
Right. So there's this whole, so like we said, right, it's the whole political game. I think just as China doesn't want an investigation, it is very likely other countries don't want to outright come and say that, hey, China, you had a bioweapons attack either on your in your territory, or the fact that you might have tried to do something in your labs and that has escaped. Either of which are pretty damning suspicions if they're proven to be true, right? And there is a political cost of making that allegation in the absence of proof, and there's no way to gather proof unless there's an investigation. So we are in a catch-22 situation there. The whole BWC angle is the situation is a little weird with that setup because the BWC does not have any powers to investigate on its own. It is a bunch of rules that basically say that you are not allowed to keep any bioweapons. You are not allowed to use bioweapons or transfer technologies that can be used for bioweapon purposes. And then what happens if there is a bioweapons attack, provide cooperation and funding and all of that. Except for all of those, you need to first prove that there was a bioweapons attack. And you can't prove that without actually activating the BWC. So I think just activating the BWC within itself has this very huge political cost, which I don't think countries are likely to bear, predominantly because it is unlikely to actually result in any serious investigation. So the way the BWC works is it cannot investigate on its own. It will request the UNSC, which is the United Nations Security Council, to investigate on its behalf. And then the UNSC obviously has a very unique structure, which I think, Aditya, you can talk a bit more about the P5 states and the power they have to veto any investigation and resolutions.
Yeah, so obviously the problem with the PWC is that you actually have to initiate a complaint, and no state wants to incur the political cost of that, especially when I suspect most states don't actually think that a biological weapon is involved. But like you said, even if there was a serious concern about biological weapons, it is hard to actually go and investigate. If you look at the Chemical Weapons Convention, which is actually a far more robust treaty. It has more people, there's more support for it. It has actually managed to do some investigations. The one that I think most of us are familiar with is, of course, Syria.
Yes.
But even in the case of Syria, it really took the efforts of then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. It took fairly robust consensus within the Security Council, the UN Security Council, 5 big members, to actually have these investigations, joint investigations between the UN and the OPCW, which is the organization that actually implements the Chemical Weapons Convention. So if one of those members of the UN Security Council were, of course, to veto a resolution or to oppose any such investigation, it would be fairly difficult for the UN to go ahead with it.
And obviously China is one such member who has the power to veto any investigation.
Exactly.
Yes, and I think we bring out a really interesting point about the chemical weapons convention and the biological weapons convention. Obviously, there's a stark difference in the amount of funding that the two get, and the actual manpower. So I think the CWC has roughly about 400 to 500 employees. The BWC, on the other hand, has three.
That's three people in the implementation support unit.
Yeah, that's three people in the implementation support unit. Funding is extremely poor. I think last year they had a review meeting, or rather an expert meeting, which was supposed to look at advances in biotechnology and gene editing and how that might actually impact the bioweapons sphere. And so they had the scientific meeting, and post which the diplomats were supposed to meet and discuss about what changes should be made to the BWC structure, but they had so little funding that they actually spent that conference figuring out a funding mechanism for the three members that it's supposed to fund over the next year. So that I think was a lost opportunity right there. And I think the third big difference between those two conventions is that the Chemical Weapons Convention has a scientific board to advise it on what kind of chemicals should we be looking out for, are there threats anywhere, etc., etc. The BWC actually doesn't have a scientific board. So there is no expert independent committee which is advising it on threats. And I think from a weapons point of view, though, the difference is that if you use a chemical weapons, you are more or less sure. If there is a use, you can more or less be sure that it has been used. The bioweapons is not that clear, as you can see from the current pandemic. I mean, even though we have a host of evidence that this is a naturally born outbreak, we cannot say definitively whether it came from a natural source or whether it was a naturally formed virus which escaped from a lab, right? And there's no way of us from knowing without an investigation at all. And I think those are some critical factors that have exposed the vulnerabilities in our international structures and organizations that are supposed to actually help us be more secure in our, at least have a little more higher level of biosecurity than we currently have.
Yeah, and the differences between investigating a chemical weapons attack and a biological weapons attack are actually quite interesting because with the chemical weapons attack, most of the chemical that was actually used may have been long dispersed, but you will have residues. You might have residues, on surfaces. You might have residues within the munitions that were used, and you can judge from the symptoms of people, and you can maybe come to a conclusion about whether they were used, what chemical weapon was used, and so on. With the biological weapon, so long as so long as you can isolate that pathogen, you have clinching evidence that that pathogen is responsible. What you don't have, and what can be ambiguous, is whether that the release of that pathogen is deliberate, and whether that pathogen is made artificially by humans.
Yeah, right. So I think there are two things that we have to be extremely clear about when we talk about either a biological weapon or a naturally occurring outbreak, is that there are two ways that a pathogen can evolve. It can either evolve naturally, so within organisms, could be animals, could be humans, or it can be artificially tampered with by humans, right? So those are two sources of evolution. But these viruses can come from three different sources. Either they jump from animals to humans, which are the zoonotic viruses, the Nipah, for example. It can be a naturally made virus which was being cultured in the lab for some reason and then escaped from the lab. Anthrax, for example, we had that accident in Russia where the pathogen escaped from the lab. It wasn't a deliberate attack, but it was negligence. And then third was an actual deliberate attack. So viruses are kept in labs. They are used for research purposes, either to create vaccines or to understand how they work better so that we can create better diagnostics or cures for them. And we have had incidences in the past throughout the globe where they have gone missing through negligence.
Yeah. Right. You spoke about the leak of anthrax in the Soviet Union. This occurred in 1979, after the Soviet Union had signed the Biological Weapons Convention. So, this is a secret program. There was an anthrax leak. Something like 60 people died. And this really came out only after the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it came to light because doctors had basically retained old autopsy reports. Otherwise, we may not have even known about it, or may have only had, say, oral evidence about it. So one of the defects, if you will, of the Biological Weapons Convention is that it doesn't really have a verification mechanism. When we talk about arms control agreements, one of the one of the most difficult parts of any arms control agreement is verification. And you always have diplomats breaking their heads over it. In the case of the BWC, they basically just gave up. And
After
that
repeated
is one of
tries.
those. Yes, and so that's one of the big flaws. The other big flaws, of course, that see all arms control agreements are products of their times and the technologies of their times. Now, technology has changed greatly since 1975. The most obviously, you have gene editing. You have tools like CRISPR. Shambhavi, so how does the BWC deal with this new environment where you have these gene editing tools, where you have new threats from non-state actors? Does the BWC need to be reformed or just even overhauled completely?
Yeah, I think for a while now, people have been saying, even if the gene editing threat might be new, people have been saying for a while now that the BWC definitely needs to be restructured and reimagined for a new technology. I think, and I know, Aditya, you and I have had long conversations about the actual impact of biological weapons, right? And a lot of these treaties have been developed thinking that weapons are going to be used for mass destruction, that we will have like massive deaths at the end of a weapon use, chemicals or nuclear. Unlike chemicals and nuclear weapon, a biological weapon might be used as a weapon of economic destruction. And we need to approach containment or disarmament from that thinking, that people might not be keeping large piles of biological weapons, or like biological weapons will only be used to kill people. I think there is a lot of apprehension that we might not be able to create that perfect virus or that perfect pathogen which will kill only the enemy, and which is the reason why many state or non-state actors would not go the way of creating a biological weapons. But if you remove the death angle from it, and if you say that, hey, this will only decrease productivity, or this will only impact a certain kind of crop that a country grows, and thereby cripple its economy, then the scenarios under which biological weapons will be used become more likely. Gene editing actually facilitates that kind of engineering of pathogens. And it is in this context that I think the BWC has to be strengthened, and has to be completely overhauled. Countries have to take more responsible positions in making sure that a verification mechanism of some sort can be passed, or at least the confidence building measures that currently exist are strengthened and not kept as a voluntary paper filling exercise that a lot of countries do. So there are things that need to be strengthened. I think India can play a really big role in getting that strengthening done.
Actually, Shambhavi, you make a really good point there because, back in the 1970s when US President Richard Nixon was trying to justify signing on to the BWC, the Biological Weapons Convention, he said, he made the argument that if somebody uses biological weapons on us, we'll just nuke them.
Yeah.
Now, it's not that simple even back then. But today, when you have a wide range of scenarios in which you can use biological weapons, and you can use them for sort of attacks that are not necessarily directly lethal to humans, you can use them for fairly limited attacks. In fact, if you look really since 1975 at the ways in which biological weapons have been used by states, actually it's biological toxins that have been used for assassinating individuals.
Yeah.
So there's obviously this wide range of attacks that states can mount using biological weapons. What probably stops them from doing more of that is that there's a lot of norms against the use of biological weapons. There's a serious taboo. Unfortunately, deterrence in the way it used to work before, or may have worked before, is not applicable anymore, because if one state can, say, destroy or disrupt a certain crop in another state, unless the other state has an equivalent or symmetric capability, responding is very difficult.
Yeah, and I think that you made an interesting point about the taboo as well. I think the taboo against biological weapons also pervades our thinking of any outbreak. I think a lot of why we do not believe, even with the COVID-19, we see obviously there's evidence that supports that this is not a deliberate attack. But even the negligence part, there is so much at the back of our mind that we do not want to believe that this could be not a natural outbreak. And I think that taboo plays a role in this as well. There was so much being said about why biological weapons are like the most inhumane of all weapons that we could unleash. And I think that has kind of stayed with us for a while now. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I think we have lost the deterrence of using a biological weapon, particularly because if we can do a covert attack, then it actually makes sense to use a biological weapon. If we have developed something on those lines that no one can actually attribute it back to you. If the world keeps on fighting over that, hey, this is a natural origin, we just have to figure out which animal it came from, then you have that kind of shield to protect yourself. So I think we have lost the deterrence of using a biological weapon. I think over time we're actually creating more and more, over time we are reducing the barriers for somebody to use a biological weapon.
Yeah, I agree. So the barriers have actually come down, and one of the things that might actually reduce those barriers further is quite simply the fact that at the end of this pandemic, most countries are going to be fairly well prepared for a future pandemic. And what that really means is that their biodefenses are improved.
Let's hope so. We hope that happens. I think the other thing that this has also exposed is that solving the origin of a pandemic is more a political question than a scientific question.
Yeah, exactly. So which brings me to the final question, Shambhavi. What do we do? How do we go from here?
I think from what we have seen, we need more of small groups of countries to come together and form alliances on biosecurity. Our international organizations have become so politically mired that expecting them to do something is tricky. And the other thing I think we definitely need is a BWC with a scientific board. Our current problem in having a complete investigation of the SARS-CoV-2 is the fact that no country wants to bear the political cost of alleging a bioweapons attack. So we need a board that can suo motu decide that a public threat or a pandemic which has caused so many lives is actually warrants a thorough investigation. And again, it is not to blame a country or a technology. It is basically to figure out what went wrong and how we can stop it from happening again. I think the worst thing we can do is to take steps which are populist but not going to be helpful at all. Things like banning technologies, because obviously things like CRISPR, gene editing are extremely useful. They have medical purposes that need to be developed. Even within agriculture, for example, there's a program from DARPA known as the Insect Allies program, where they're trying to create these insects that can deliver gene editing components to plants. So the idea is that if you are, say, if you're farming a certain coconut plants or something like that, and there is a kind of fungus that is now coming and destroying your plants, you call up the agency, and the agency will create these insects which will basically come and genetically modify your plants to fight off the fungus. Obviously, once you develop that kind of an insect, whatever it can then harbor a lot of different kinds of cargo, and some of that cargo might not be useful to plants. But I mean, that's the kind of tricky area of science that we need to figure out. What we want to do ahead, right? I think we need to have those sort of conversations going ahead, is how we can best use science to protect the earth and not have these kind of devastation scenarios that we currently have.
Yeah, there are lots of dilemmas ahead, and this is a vexing problem, and it's a problem that I think has become more real in the minds of people now. Thank you so much for joining us, Shambhavi.
Thank you, Aditya. Thank you for listening in, everybody.
And thank you for joining us.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. We appreciate their support. It's been a really fun week, guys. We've had some great episodes on your old favorites. Cyrus Says, Advertising is Dead, Edges and Sledges, Football Shitball had a really fun episode as well. Definitely do check it out. I'm sure you're going to enjoy yourselves. And thanks for listening, and we hope to catch you again next week.
Namaskar, dear Bandhu. My name is Ashish Vidyarthi. These are truly challenging times, and in these times, we need hope. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey. Available on IVM Podcasts, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, there is hope because there's one life and we are alive.